So yeah, when I was asked to chair this, I was excited. I mean, I think I'm a geographer. I study kind of global development, and I kind of an epiphany moment for me when I was sort of, you know, I can't remember when, so many epiphanies. But though, you know, looking at maps of Africa, I remember this idea that, you know, these 17th century maps of Africa, there was this kind of, you know, a couple of little towns dotted on the coast, and then this kind of pictures of lions and stuff, and this idea of terra nullius. And I think, you know, for you know, when you try and understand the relationship between sort of colonial power, territory, and kind of, you know, what was going on at that period, to have that kind of sense of, you know, a spaceless place where that was ripe for kind of exploitation was really powerful. And I think, you know, that kind of relationship between representation and spaces and mapping has always been something I've been really interested in. So it's really great that we've got speakers today who are going to reflect on how we understand and think about the global commons today. One slight unfortunateness is that Natalie has had to fly back to the States for family reasons, so we only have 2 presenters today, but that's probably more than enough, actually, given the kind of breadth of the topic we needed to cover. We've got Dan and Derek. I think Dan's going to speak first. Contrary to what Umit said, we've given them at least 3 hours each to speak. No, there's going to be a slightly longer period to speak because we've got 90 minutes. We don't want speakers to dominate the proceedings, but a sort of 15-minute intervention by both speakers, and then we'll open it up. And as Umit says, I think it'd be great that, you know, don't feel like it has to be a Q&A where everything kind of goes back to the quote-unquote experts on the podium kind of thing, although that's fine if that is what you want to do. But, you know, let's try and make it a kind of transversal conversation across disciplines would be great, and I'll do my best to do that. But as you say, ping away in the chat box or whatever. So first up, as I said, we're going to have Dan, who's going to talk about rights for none and all, the historical demise of the commons and the problems of power. So over to you, Dan.
Lovely. Thanks very much, Giles. So hopefully you can see an image on the screen. It's Bruegel's image of the harvesters. Does that come up with the title? Or is it just...
It does. Yeah? Just for me, anyway.
Great, lovely. Yeah, thank you, Giles. So I'm Dan. I'm a lecturer in social and political thought. This paper, it's going to mainly be history. And even though history, I kind of consider it as like the earliest social science, it's not part of SSGS. So it's coming from history and politics, in case you're thinking like you've suddenly been shortchanged. And I've put it together in such a way that it will lead to some of the interesting questions that Derek is thinking about at the moment in terms of space ethics. Now, what am I going to do? So in this talk, I'm going to give an introduction really to the idea of the commons, kind of where historically it comes from. And I'm going to explore 3 questions. Hopefully I'll remember to include this as a slide. Yes, I have a few. Where did the idea of the commons come from? Why did the concepts and language of the commons, commonwealth, and so on disappear? And what can we learn from the history of political thought, which is the area that I kind of work in, one of many hats, about the challenges for thinking about the commons today? So this is the order of business, and I'm going to present one provocation, and that's that the commons, the idea that something, be it land or space, can simply belong to one and all without a concept of public ownership or power. It doesn't quite work. So I'm going to hone in on this idea of power and the state. This is where I'm going with this. That no one has a right to the commons unless they're willing to stand up and assert or defend that right as the commons, which is why the concept of the commons is very much tied up with political protest and resistance. And I think that's how it's been a really fertile concept in that area. Okay, now this is the one bit that I'm going to do about space. Derek's covering it. Now this is the image of the pale blue dot from 1990, taken by NASA's Voyager 1 space probe. Now this is a photograph of planet Earth. It's a pale blue dot, which is kind of in the middle, a bit up. So the Earth appears here as a pale blue dot, dwarfed by the vastness of space. Now there's a lovely quote about this. This is where I'm starting. Remarking on that image, which is 1990, the same year that Germany was reunified, the philosopher Carl Sagan remarked, and here's the quote: "There is perhaps no better demonstration of the folly of human conceits than this distant image of our tiny world. Images of the Earth from afar have contributed to a global international consciousness of human life as sharing in one planet and therefore one fundamental identity. Images of the Earth viewed from afar also suggest that the boundaries or borders between individual nations, lives, cultures become less relevant, less worth living and dying for, through an extraplanetary consciousness. But missing from these images are the largely invisible borders, where it'd be so hard to see in this picture, but the largely invisible borders that reflect and determine political, social, and economic life and its possibilities for billions around the world. Now, these borders, they're man-made. Borders, fences, if I think, why am I using the word fences? I promise it's relevant. These borders and fences are man-made, imagined and contested. Well, not always imagined, they're very real if you're excluded. And that's the issue. It's the consequences that come with these borders. There has been rapid globalization over the last 30, 40 years, or 30 years since that image was taken, with an unprecedented movement of goods, people, capital, ideas. Yet more borders and border walls are being constructed around the world than ever before. And between these borders, before these borders, is another concept that we've all come to think about, which is the commons. And this is where I'm going to get to. So the commons, in simple terms, what is it? So the idea of the commons, it originates from the historical practice of sharing, I'll explain this in a second, of sharing resources within a community. In its most basic form, the commons refers to the resources that are collectively owned or shared between or among populations. These resources are said to be held in common, which can include anything from natural resources like air, water, or land, or water, to socially constructed resources such as public places, scientific research, and creative works like music, literature, and art. And so even the word common comes from the Latin communis, which is com, together, and munis, which is under obligation. So coming under obligation together to a kind of collective. Or you can even have com and unis, which is together as one. So the common is a kind of it's a collective. It becomes a singularity of different people. So perhaps the earliest hunter-gatherer societies observed the form of the commons. What one member of the tribe hunted or gathered wasn't just for their own use, but for the collective. But this seems kind of shaky, don't worry, I'm not going to go too far with that. So I don't think this gets us too far. So, and the image here is from the Peasants' Revolt. You have the kind of, like with a lot of medieval tapestry images, you actually have a kind of different moments in time. You have the king both on the right, you know, kind of addressing Wat Tyler and the peasants who had kind of risen up as the commons on the right-hand side, making promises. And then you see him on the left with the mayor of London about to kill the leader of the peasants, Wat Tyler. I guess what reason why I picked out this image is the commons are faceless. You know, they're kind of a force, a collective force, but a faceless force. Okay, human societies shifted from nomadic to more agrarian lifestyles around 10,000 years ago. But this is where I'm going to get deeper, I promise. Yet the idea of the commons, as we understand it, only really emerges in medieval Europe, particularly England. So Raymond Williams, in Keywords under the entry common, notes its very early use from the 14th to the 17th centuries. And he says it's an adjective and noun of social division, common, the common, and commons, as contrasted with lords and nobility, which is what you see here. So you have this tension really in the commons as something that is of the common people versus the lords, the nobility, the bishops, and so on. The commons could be like a social group. It could also be a specific type of shared resource, the common land. This is where we're getting more to the space side. This was land that was owned collectively by a village or a group of people, not by a single individual. These lands, I think I've got an image. Yes, okay. And again, I'll explain these. These lands often included pastures, woods, and bodies of water. They were lands that were used for grazing livestock, fishing, hunting, gathering firewood, and other resources. Each commoner or member of the community had the right to access and use the commons for their own needs. So an example of this is what you see on the, well, both actually, is the system of farming that they used up until maybe the 16th, 17th century in England. I'm not going to get too deep with the farming history, but I just need to put it there. It's the open field system of farming used in this time. So villagers would each farm their own individual plot, but in this period, the plough that was used to farm the land required quite a large team of ox. So basically, the only way to really farm this land effectively was to work together with other fellow villagers and neighbours. So the common lands would kind of work together collectively in this way. But also with the open field system, I promise I won't get too deep with it, but the way it worked, you know, it was a good system for its time, was that you rotated the use of the fields for different things. So one field would be used for wheat, you see that there, nothing for barley. And then after a while, the field gets exhausted, so it becomes fallow and you let animals graze there. And animal droppings make the land fertile again, and it kind of goes around like this. It was, you know, this is the open field system. It worked well, and it required a commons kind of social arrangement. So as villagers shared land, there was also a shared sense of community because everyone was reliant and also responsible for the same shared resource. Villages became collective stewards, but it also eliminated choice. So farmers just had to continue with what others were doing. It's worth noting that these early forms of the commons weren't without rules and regulations. The whole Garrett Harding tragedy of the commons thing, this is where we're going to get to. And again, it's to set up, Derek. So there were often strict community guidelines dictating how and when the commons could be used to prevent overuse and to manage sustainability. There will be restrictions on what animals could be grazed or what time of year, or when wood or turf could be cut. So you cut turf for heating in this time. So this concept is sometimes referred to as, by Eleanor Ostrom at least, as common pool resource management. Now, another interesting example is just some more kind of peasants at work type images, but I'm going to give you a specific example, which is slightly different, but builds on this idea of the commons as a kind of a political and social body. Actually, these are so lovely. I'm going to come back to them. This here is the Charter of the Forest of 1217. So this relates to the royal forests in England. So by the late 11th century, up to 1/3 of England was taken over by royal forest. Now, what that meant is that the king could use it for his own purposes, and ordinary people, the commoners, weren't allowed to poach or kind of take things from there. It would be a capital offence; you'd be killed for it. Now, what happened with this chart is that the commoners, what people decided that, you know, with 1/3 of the land taken off them, how could people feed themselves and live? There was resistance, there was indignation. And so in 1217, I know it's a long time ago, but actually this was the oldest piece of statute in English legislation in history. It was in place up until 1971, so 800 years. And it's also very much associated with Magna Carta. If you're trying to pin this, it's like, okay, how is this relevant to the history that I know? It's very much pinned with Magna Carta. Now, the Charter of the Forest set out to protect the right of the commons to use what was a resource for all. So when you have the Charter of the Forest isn't just a place with a lot of trees. It includes villages, it's areas without any trees like Dartmoor and Exmoor, and it's places where commoners lived and cooperatively worked out of necessity and also out of mutual advantage. So the Charter's 17 articles, let's have a lovely image of peasants at work here, perpetually uphold the rights of free individuals to use the commons for fruit picking, wood gathering, clay, animal grazing, peat harvesting, even honey collection. And Guy Standing, a political figure now, makes a lovely point that at the heart of the Charter is the concept of the commons and the need to protect them. So I guess I'm kind of setting up here a kind of an image. We've got an image that isn't just simply a kind of a nostalgic feature of medieval life, but it's also a social arrangement, and it has its own politics too. There's a kind of a politics of protection, and it's a politics that's defensive, maybe even agonistic against royalty. But the big thing is, why did common land, why did it disappear? So if the commons kind of came about as a result of one system, open field farming, then its decline was precipitated by another. So from the 16th century, you get the rise of new forms of farming technology and a new kind of discovery that you could make a lot of profit in farming through sheep farming. You also had new approaches to crop rotation and the selective breeding of animals. Basically, it meant if you were a landowner, you could suddenly extract a lot more value if you no longer had open field system, but you enclosed the land. Now, under the feudal system, the commoners didn't really have that many formal rights, and they didn't have that many ways to defend their rights. You know, you might be thinking, what about the House of Commons? But even that was something that appears in the 14th century, and it doesn't have very much power until the 17th century. So in the Tudor period, so the 16th century, I'm sorry to make you travel around, but it's just to kind of draw out an argument. England was an important producer of wool. Landowners began to use the law and sometimes brute force to build, well, not so much borders, but fences around common land to claim what was once the collectors as their own. So enclosure was an issue of sorts with the Peasants' Revolt. We had that image earlier. It was a big issue in the Jack Cades uprising, in Kett's Rebellion, Even a big concern in the Captain Pouch revolts. These are all things over 16th, 17th centuries, where you get ordinary people, ordinary commoners deciding to, I guess, take the law in their own hands and use violence to pull down fences and sometimes attack sheriffs. And at least with the Captain Pouch revolts, this was led by a figure who claimed he was inspired by God and he could protect the protesters with a magical pouch. These aren't the images I'll explain in a second. But what you get with this is also the introduction of the terms leveller. A leveller is somebody who pulls down fences of enclosure. A digger is somebody who digs the land for the common good. And it's interesting when you get the diggers in the 17th century, they, like Gerard Winstanley, they would claim the authority of God and the Bible to justify radical experiments in communal living. So in this kind of changing development from the open field system to enclosure, and you kind of see it down that sort of blurry diagram. One version is that sheep began to devour people. So Thomas More, this is Thomas More as in Wolf Hall, but Thomas More who wrote Utopia, Henry VIII's Chancellor. In Utopia, he talks about the sheep eating people. Your sheep, I quote, that were wont to be so meek and tame and so small eaters, now, as I hear say, be become so great devourers and so wild that they eat up and swallow down the very men themselves. And I guess, I mean, maybe this is something that we'll explore later when you have something that could be a kind of commons like artificial intelligence. If it's falls under the ownership of a few people and suddenly the technology not only puts people out of work or dispossesses them from the land, but also prevents people from eating themselves. Anyway, I promise you it's historical. For the acts of enclosure, there was resistance, that's important. But what we see is this kind of shift that kind of takes on its own force. So between 1760 and 1870, about 7 million acres, or 1/6 of England, changes ownership from common land to enclosed land. And this is driven in large part by parliamentary acts. And what it creates, you get this in England, but not in France, is huge numbers of landless, dispossessed labourers who are forced to migrate to the cities or to settler colonies and a new world. So there's a connection here, I would say, with Industrial Revolution, capitalism and colonialism. So as the commons disappeared, you have a new social figure, and that's the private individual. So Raymond Williams, again, talks about with this kind of dispossession, you get a new shift to a kind of individualization where property is no longer something that belongs to the commons, but it belongs to a private individual. And Raymond Williams says, there is a great deal of social history in this transfer across the range of ordinary description from common, even as common's a positive term, to private. Now, this is where we get a little bit of philosophy, but I won't burn you too much with it. So this comes up in a kind of changing ideas about what politics and society is into the 17th century. Thomas Hobbes, who redefined our understanding of natural rights in the state. So for Hobbes, in the state of nature, this is just a war of all against all. What the commons owns is nothing because it will just lead to mutual conflict. What they need to escape out of the solitary, poor, nasty, brutish and short state is to transfer their right to one governing authority, the Leviathan, which you get in this famous image here. Now, John Locke proposes a kind of his horrible image of the war of all against all, of the state of nature. Now, John Locke, on the other hand, he's not in this image. This is just a kind of to illustrate the state of nature. John Locke, on the other hand, proposes a slightly different version where individuals, by forming the civil society, have the right to life, liberty, echoes with the United States Constitution, and property. For Locke, property is really important. It's the mixing of our labour with natural resources. But again, like Hobbes, he agrees that property rights are only protected, individual property rights, under a social contract with the state. So again, it's another way in which the commons becomes undermined, because if rights are linked to individual ownership and the power of the state, where does that leave the shared communal lands of the commons? Where would the values of mutual obligation, commonality and egalitarianism fit into this new understanding of power, underscored by private property, security and force? So this is where I'm going to try and set up a kind of debate, and maybe Derek can help us with this. So the two ways, I think, of looking at this kind of rapid ride through history. E.P. Thompson called enclosure a plain enough case of class robbery. It leads to the forced disappearance of a class of people, the yeoman class, and it really impacts the labouring poor. You get a lot of homelessness in cities during the Tudor period. But another argument, this is the Garrett Hard argument that I'm going to set up now, is that all of this was a necessary evil, that it was not for the good of the commons to maintain an egalitarian, traditional, but inefficient agricultural practice that couldn't support a growing population. that either you could have the backwardness of the commons or you get the innovation of the private property in the market. So when Garrett Hardin approaches this later on, he says that common property systems, they allow individuals to profit while imposing costs on the community, leading to their inevitable decay, depletion, and collapse. And here's a kind of image, basically, as he sees it, when the self-interest of people in the commons means that the common resource just gets depleted. It leads to polluted streams, polluted seas, polluted atmospheres, and so on. And the only way you escape out of this tragedy of the commons is through private property. So you get a kind of presentation here in terms of the debate as like an either or choice. You have progressive changes like industrialization and land enclosure, or you have the kind of stagnant backwardness and starvation of the commons. And E.P. Thompson is good here. He says, well, actually, it's not an either or thing. You know, we shouldn't look at things in terms of economic determinism. There was always, and there always remains, the possibility of a progressive, more compassionate kind of development using new technology and redistributing it fairly. So this is where I'm rounding up. But as the commons and the dispossessed knew in the early modern period, there are no rights without power. Power is the sum of an organized collective force. For those without any political power formally, their rights, like the enclosure riots and so on, were only recognized through riots, disobedience, and uprisings. These uprisings were issues like the Peasants' Revolt because they revealed that royal authority rested ultimately on popular support, popular sovereignty. In that sense, while early social contract theorists talked about transferring power to the king, you know, like Hobbes and Locke, others like the Levelers in the 17th century or Spinoza talked about transforming institutions of power for a free, informed, democratic republic, one whose authority rested on pursuing the common good and well-being of all. So the lasting challenge here, and I promise this is the end of it, is the lasting utility of terms like the commons. So from artificial intelligence to the Arctic to space, to stay common, there needs to be a means of standing up, defending, and if necessary, pulling down the fences. So I'll stop there and thank you for being patient listeners.
Brilliant, thanks, Dan. Wow, lots to mull over, and I think, yeah, lovely kind of historical kind of but critical overview of where we're at. I'm going to turn to Derek.
My presentation is much narrower than Dan's, and I'm going to sort of focus on the question of who owns the global commons, or what's the best way to think of the relationship between the global commons and ownership. I've recently become quite fascinated with the global commons, and this is really at the very start of a research program for me. And I sometimes think it's probably, talking to people about the global commons is probably me saying something like, gosh, there's this amazing actress called Judi Dench. Everybody else knows about it and has been thinking about it for years. So forgive me if my enthusiasms are slightly naive, but all these things came as a revelation to me. So what things these days are classified as sort of legal classifications as the global commons? Well, there are only 5. There's the atmosphere, the deep seabed, so that's the seabed outside territorial waters, and the high seas, so the seas outside territorial waters. Just pause for a moment here to say, I mean, all of these things are governed by their own treaties. But the one, because I'm going to be talking mainly about space, and the space treaty was linked to the Convention of the Law of the Sea. They're both sort of being thought about at roughly the same time, and the thoughts that went into the Convention of the Law of the Sea and the space treaty sort of interacted with each other. There might have even been same people on both committees. And the Convention of the Law of the Sea is very interesting. It's one of the UN conventions, certainly not the first UN convention. I think that might have been the 1954 Hague Convention on Cultural Property, which talks about the common heritage of all mankind. So that's part of what's going to feed into the thought of these things being global commons, is that the common heritage of all mankind, humankind. So that we kind of all have a stake in them because they are all about heritage. So there's the atmosphere, the deep sea bed, the high seas, Antarctica, which is obviously governed by the Antarctica Treaty. Then outer space, and this is regulated by the 1967 United Nations Outer Space Treaty. And this is an interesting treaty. I mean, there's there are a number of schools of thought about why it has the form that it has. And the ones, because it is, as we'll come on to see in a moment, it is it looks quite binding on nation states. And so there's always the questions, why would a nation state voluntarily sign up to something that's binding on them? Well, one thought is that in 1967, nobody really anticipated being able to get much out of space in terms of resources, so they didn't really mind what they were signing up to, because it was all kind of sort of beyond over the horizon anyway. And that's slightly less true now, as we will discover. What's the definition of the global commons? So you can call something a global commons, but what does that mean? Well, it's really two main things. The first, which we've picked up from things that Dan was saying, is non-excludability. So anybody can go there. So to go back to the high seas, anybody is allowed to sail on the high seas. Nobody can prevent anybody from sailing on the high seas. And this is covered in Article 1 of the Outer Space Treaty, which is that outer space, including the moon and other celestial bodies, shall be free for exploration and use by all states without discrimination of any kind, on the basis of equality and in accordance with international law. And there shall be free access to all areas of celestial bodies. And that's sounds very fine, and obviously is very fine. There's a couple of sort of tweaks that might have occurred to you. One is that it's an unfortunate fact about, or maybe no, probably a fortunate fact about the universe, that no two things can occupy the same space at the same time. So although there is this nice Article 1 about non-excludability, if you think about satellite orbits, not all satellite orbits are equal. Some satellite orbits are better than others. And if you have a satellite on a certain orbit, that is effectively going to prevent somebody else from sticking their satellite in exactly that orbit. So although there is non-excludability, anybody can go there, you can't go to the same place that somebody else has gone to. So there's a lot of kind of first actor benefit for non-excludability. And the same obviously applies to the high seas. Ships are relatively small compared to the high seas. The high seas are relatively big. So putting a ship on the high seas, putting a British ship on the high seas means that a French ship can't occupy that exact space on the high seas. But non-excludability is one of the defining features of the global commons. And then there's non-rivalry. So ideally, one state taking advantage of the commons does not disadvantage another state from taking advantage. So you might think, so public goods such as parks are paradigmatically non-excludable and non-rivalrous. So the fact that I'm going to the park doesn't prevent you from going to the park. We can all go to the park, within reason, of course. And this is also governed in Article 2 of the Outer Space Treaty. And this is that outer space, including the moon and other celestial bodies, is not subject to national appropriation by claim of sovereignty, by means of use or occupation, or by any other means. So you can't go up to space or the moon and claim bits of it of your own, and because that's going to disadvantage other people. They won't be able to take advantage of the commons in the same way that you have. And this provision against national appropriation has become more vexed in recent years, or sort of more vexed at the moment, with various things going on, which I'll come and talk about in a second. So here's a sort of conceptual question, really, of who owns the global commons, and there might actually be a simple legal answer to this question, but if there is, I haven't managed to find it. And I have asked some people who I would have thought would have known had there been a relatively simple answer to this question. But if anybody knows the answer, I'd be grateful if they could tell it to me. So the one thought is that it's owned by everybody, and that came up in a couple of times in Dan's talk when he talked about back in the day, the 11th century, 12th century, there was a commons that was owned by the village, or owned by everybody in the village. And this ties in well with the other phrase that crops up in these treaties of the global heritage of all mankind. Because if it is the global heritage of all mankind, then all mankind owns the commons. So everybody owns it. It explains our interest in and responsibility for the commons. So we own it, we have an interest in it, and we're responsible for it. Why? Well, because we own it. But it does have various problems attached to it. Okay, the one is that ownership is a matter of use rights, but I do not appear to have use rights. So what does this mean? Well, ownership is a sort of rather vexed philosophical category. So you might think that if you own something, the definition of owning something is you can do what you like to it. But that's not quite right, because if my house is in a conservation zone, then I can't do what I like to it, in the sense of I can't put whatever tiles I want on the roof. There's going to be a sort of list of tiles that I'm allowed to put on the roof. So ownership doesn't necessarily, although I still own my house, so ownership doesn't necessarily mean I can do exactly what I like to it. So it's constrained in various ways. But nonetheless, you might say, oh well, ownership means that I'm the person with maximal use rights. So if anybody has use rights, then I do. That's what it is for ownership. But nonetheless, it doesn't seem, it doesn't sort of see much conceptual sense in my thinking that I have use rights of bits of outer space. It would be nice, for example, if I did, that I could, because I'm not going to have much use for my bits of outer space that of which I can claim ownership, or the proportion. It's not necessarily going to be the proportion of outer space, but my ownership interest in the outer space, because I don't particularly want it. I'm very happy to sell it to anybody who wants it. But that clearly thought doesn't make much sense. So I don't have the use right of being able to dispose of anything in outer space, and that sort of makes me think, at least, well, in that case, I can't really attach much substance to the thought that I am part of that body that owns it. And the other thought, sort of rather simple thought, is that if outer space is such that it's owned by everybody, all of us, then, and this ties into it being the global heritage of all humankind, that is a bit tough on any possible Martians or Venusians or anybody else who might be, any other entities who might be out there, who might be surprised with the claim that everything that they look out to in their night sky is in fact owned by, I can't remember Douglas Adams' phrase, but a sort of the inhabitants of a sort of rather trivial planet on some other trivial part of the galaxy. So the idea that the global commons is owned by everybody does have some sort of nice features to it, but it also has some conceptually less nice features to it. So here's an alternative. It's actually owned by nobody. So it's the terra nullis idea of the early days of colonialism and exploration. Now this makes sense of the link, in that if owned by everybody made sense of the link with the commons being the global heritage of all humankind. The idea that it's owned by nobody makes sense of the link, which is drawn by Dan, between commons and the state of nature. Because if we think of the state of nature as kind of the state of the world before ownership, when it was owned by nobody, then we've got that link between the global commons and the state of nature. It doesn't, however, provide an explanation for our interest in and responsibility for the commons. If I don't own it, so here would be the thought: if I don't own it, I have no interest in it, and therefore I'm not responsible for it. And now that might be a linked set of thoughts that you might want to reject, but nonetheless, there isn't the kind of easy explanation of why it is that I have an interest in and responsibility for the commons that is provided by the thought that the commons are owned by everybody. And it doesn't easily explain why the commons are not subject to appropriation. So if we think that part of the definition of the global commons is they're not subject to appropriation, however, the commons are owned by nobody, then at least that raises the question of why they're not subject to appropriation. Now, the answer to that might be actually very simple. It might be just that, oh, well, they're the kind of thing that's owned by nobody for which we have this rule that they're not subject for appropriation. So that explains why the Commons is not subject to appropriation. And that's kind of, in as much as the outer space treaties do prevent appropriation, that just might be the case. So if we go for it's owned by nobody plus the outer space treaty explains why it's not subject to appropriation. But it's quite interesting that in the corridors of power of the US at the moment, there's a sort of debate as to whether the outer space is in fact owned by nobody, because there is at least the thought there in the heads of some people that if it's owned by nobody, that's going to make the jump to appropriation easier than if it's owned by everybody. So there are both advantages and disadvantages with both of these models. Neither of them are ones that you think, oh well, that's obviously the right answer, and that does sort of pose a bit of a poser. And I had set this talk up deliberately in order to feed into Natalie's talk, because I'm going to end with a question that I was hoping that Natalie would be able to answer, because I know that she does think along these lines, but I never actually asked her what her answer was. So, and I haven't a clue. So it would be nice to know if anybody could tell me what the answer is at the end. So as Dan was saying, we need to solve the Harden's tragedy of the commons. That is, non-exclusion plus no limits on extraction result in depletion. So if the global commons are by definition non-exclusory and there are no limits on extraction, as Dan was saying, in history there were limits on extraction. There are now current limits on extraction, fishing treaties, etc., but you will all be familiar with terrible tales of overfishing and so on and so forth, and that's basically because you can't stop people going onto the high seas, and if you don't stop what they can take out of the high seas, then we get depletion. Harden's thought was we can replace these two models of ownership with limited private ownership. So if at least that gives if there is private ownership, then non-excludability goes, and also there being no limits on extraction goes, and we are able to put brakes on depletion. There's Eleanor Ostrom's very interesting work about cooperation, the thought that we can enforce cooperation. I'm not quite sure how the Ostrom view about enforcing cooperation, I'm not quite sure what the relation is between that and the two models of ownership. That's something I'm going to have to think through. But that's another idea. So we keep whatever the model of ownership is going to be, we keep the idea that there's a global commons, and we sort of come up with rules, enforceable rules, such that the global commons work in such a way that we don't have to go down the Harden route and talk about private ownership. But the interesting thing about these two ways of solving the tragedy of the commons is that they stay within the realm of thinking about ownership. So we're looking, and in fact my whole talk has been about ownership. So we're sort of looking at ownership and models of ownership to solve these two problems. And what Natalie and Ali Marino have been talking about to each other, but not necessarily to me, is to come up with some model that doesn't presuppose ownership. So there's some kind of alternative way of thinking about the commons, which is outside our thinking of ownership, in such a way that we sort of get the best benefits out of it, and we don't land ourselves up with these conceptual problems. And I guess the interesting thing about this option is that if it's true, if what I've been saying is true, that thinking through what look to be the two alternatives of the ownership model of the global commons, if both of those are kind of conceptually problematic, then that would be an argument for at least thinking about the third bullet point there, of coming up with some model that kind of just stands outside these notions of ownership altogether. And I think that's probably me done. Yes, it is. Thanks.